Picture a human being a few thousand years ago. Life is objectively terrible. You are cold. Your teeth hurt. Half of your tribe was recently wiped out by a particularly aggressive strain of prehistoric diarrhea, and your daily commute involves outrunning apex predators. You are, biologically speaking, an ape with severe, untreated anxiety. So, what do? If you are one of our ingenious, desperate ancestors, you wander around the harsh, windswept steppes of Central Asia, you find a jagged-leafed green bush, and you decide, against all basic survival instincts, to set it on fire and breathe in the smoke. It is one of the most absurd behavioral leaps in human history. We are a species uniquely obsessed with altering our own consciousness. We ferment rotting fruit to get drunk, we lick specific amphibians to hallucinate. But perhaps no relationship between human and plant is as complicated, as legally fraught, or as historically fascinating as our love affair with cannabis sativa. Today, it is a multi-billion-dollar industry, a Schedule I narcotic in many places, and the punchline to 1,000 terrible jokes. But for most of human history, it wasn't a controversy. It was a lifeline. So who was the first person to look at this leafy green weed and think, I should smoke that? It is a simple question, with a very complicated answer. But to understand the high, we first have to understand the hard labor, because before humanity was smoking cannabis, we were wearing it. Around 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age gracefully receded and left humanity to clean up the mess, the agricultural revolution began. We started domesticating plants, wheat for bread, barley for beer, and cannabis for rope. You see, the cannabis plant is an evolutionary overachiever. It grows incredibly fast, requires very little water, and its stalks are packed with bast fibers, some of the longest and strongest natural fibers on the planet. Early humans in Central Asia, particularly in what is now modern-day China, realized that if you stripped this plant down, you can twist it into bowstrings, weave it into durable clothing, and knot it into fishing nets. We didn't cultivate cannabis to escape reality. We cultivated it to survive reality. For thousands of years, hemp was the plastic of the ancient world. It was essential. It was utilitarian. It was completely, utterly boring. If you chewed on the leaves of these early hemp plants, you wouldn't experience profound cosmic revelations. You would just get a stomachache. The plant, in its natural early state, had incredibly low levels of tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, the psychoactive compound that makes reality feel slightly softer around the edges. But ropes don't make you stare at the stars for 3 hours. Something else was happening. It turns out, early humans weren't just looking for better fishing nets. They were looking for a completely different kind of trip. Deep in the Pamir Mountains, on the border of modern-day China and Tajikistan, sits the jagged-leafed cemetery. It is a bleak, high-altitude graveyard sitting nearly 10,000 feet above sea level. It is not the kind of place you go for a vacation. In 2019, archaeologists excavating this 2,500-year-old site made a startling discovery. Inside the tombs, placed meticulously near the skulls of the deceased, were small wooden braziers, ancient incense burners. Inside these braziers were charred pebbles and burnt plant matter. When scientists ran a gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis on the residue, because modern archaeology is essentially just CSI with more dust, the results were undeniable. It was cannabis. But this wasn't the boring, rope-making hemp of the lowlands. The chemical signature revealed exceptionally high levels of CBN, the degradation product of THC. This was potent. This was drug-type cannabis. And they were actively smoking it. We had the evidence, we had the location, we had the high. But why here, and why then? The leading botanical theory is delightfully ironic. Cannabis plants naturally produce THC as a sort of chemical sunscreen to protect themselves from high ultraviolet radiation. Up in the thin, freezing air of the Pamir Mountains, the UV radiation is intense. The plants adapted by pumping out more THC to survive the harsh sun. The plant invented sunscreen. Humans used it to talk to ghosts. The context of the jagged-leafed cemetery is deeply emotional. These were burials. Human beings were grieving. In the face of death, our ancestors sought a bridge between the physical world and the spiritual one. They took these wooden braziers, placed red-hot stones inside them, threw high THC cannabis leaves onto the rocks, and enclosed the space, likely under a tent. They invented the hotbox. It wasn't recreational. It was a deeply profound, sensory-overloading ritual to communicate with the divine, or perhaps simply to numb the sharp, unbearable ache of losing a loved one. The altered state of consciousness provided by the THC wasn't a party trick. It was a psychological tool for processing trauma. Mourning the dead is one thing, but what about the living? Because soon, this sacred smoke would drift out of the graveyard and into the hands of the ancient world's most terrifying horsemen. Enter the Scythians. If you were an ancient empire, the Scythians were your worst nightmare. They were nomadic warriors who roamed the Eurasian steppe, mastered horseback archery, and drank the blood of their enemies. They were terrifying, heavily armed, and apparently incredibly high. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 440 BCE, famously documented the lifestyle of these nomads. He described a peculiar post-funeral cleansing ritual. The Scythians would erect a small tent made of woolen blankets, place a bowl of red-hot stones in the center, and throw cannabis seeds and leaves onto the rocks. Herodotus wrote, and I quote, "The Scythians howl in joy for the vapor bath." For a long time, uptight Victorian historians thought Herodotus was exaggerating. Then, in the mid-20th century, archaeologists digging in the frozen tombs of the Altai Mountains found the exact tents, the exact copper cauldrons, the stones, and the pouch of cannabis seeds Herodotus described. The Scythians weren't just howling, they were thoroughly historically baked. Because the Scythians were nomads, they essentially acted as an ancient, heavily armed delivery service. As they conquered, traded, and rode their way across the steppes, they brought their favorite botanical coping mechanism with them. Cannabis went on a world tour. It spread westward into Europe and southward into the Middle East and South Asia. But this brings up a profound question from the realm of evolutionary behavioral psychology. Why? Why do humans across completely different cultures, separated by thousands of miles, instantly latch onto a substance that distorts their perception of reality? Reality is exhausting. Our brains evolved to process threats. We are hyper-vigilant survival machines, constantly scanning the horizon for danger, constantly worrying about the future, constantly regretting the past. This default mode network in our brain is incredibly useful for not getting eaten by bears. It is terrible for inner peace. Cannabis, by a sheer magnificent accident of biology, produces molecules known as phytocannabinoids that perfectly fit into the endocannabinoid receptors already existing in the human nervous system, receptors designed to regulate mood, memory, pain, and stress. The plant picks the lock of human anxiety. So the nomads spread it, but the doctors refined it. It was time for the plant to trade the sweaty tents of warriors for the pristine scrolls of ancient medicine. As cannabis moved south into India, it met a culture perfectly primed to embrace it. By 1000 BCE, it was enshrined in the Atharva Veda, one of the sacred texts of Hinduism, listed as one of the 5 sacred plants that release us from anxiety. Here, cannabis wasn't just smoked, it was engineered into a culinary science. The ancient Indians created bhang, a potent mixture of ground cannabis leaves, milk, ghee, and spices. It was associated with Shiva, the god of destruction and transformation. It was used to reach spiritual ecstasy, but equally, it was prescribed by Ayurvedic physicians for pain, digestion, and sleep. Meanwhile, back in China, the mythical Emperor Shennong, considered the father of Chinese medicine, reportedly included cannabis in his pharmacopoeia around 2700 BCE. He prescribed it for over 100 ailments, including gout, rheumatism, and absent-mindedness. Ancient humans were dealing with the exact same physiological miseries we deal with today: inflamed joints, insomnia, the crushing weight of existence. And here was a weed growing aggressively in the dirt that offered a temporary pause button. It was a prehistoric anesthetic. For the vast majority of human history, from the high-altitude shamans of the Pamirs to the battle-scarred Scythian warriors to the meticulous physicians of ancient India, cannabis was a respected, integrated part of the human toolkit. It was medicine. It was a sacrament. It was a temporary truce with reality. From sacred medicine to global commodity, the journey was almost complete. But humanity has a funny habit of taking the things we worship and making them completely illegal. The modern era of cannabis is defined not by its botanical properties, but by its political utility. Fast forward to the 20th century. The plant that was once sacred to Shiva, essential to Chinese physicians, and woven into the very sails that allowed empires to cross oceans, suddenly became public enemy number 1. Driven by geopolitical tensions, racial prejudices, and the rise of synthetic pharmaceuticals, governments around the world engaged in a synchronized effort to erase cannabis from the acceptable human experience. It was a dramatic overcorrection. We took a plant that had evolved alongside us for millennia and locked it in a cage. We waged wars on it. We spent trillions of dollars trying to eradicate a weed that literally thrives in ditches. The absurdity is almost poetic. Today, as laws fracture and the plant slowly re-enters the mainstream, we are essentially just rediscovering what the ancients already knew. We are sequencing its DNA, isolating its compounds, and conducting multi-million-dollar clinical trials to prove what a Scythian warrior in a hotboxed tent figured out 2,500 years ago. It makes your joints feel better, and it makes the howling void of existence slightly less intimidating. The story of cannabis is not really a story about a plant. It is the story of us. It is a mirror reflecting our unending, desperate quest to manipulate our own biology, to find comfort in an uncomfortable world, to look at the harsh, unforgiving landscape of reality and decide that every now and then we need a vacation from our own minds. We are still stressed. We are still looking for relief. The smoke is just clearing.